I Am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Synopsis, a story about a weak, small larva with a human soul, who travels all the way to become the ruler of the stars' no system. Violent soldiers flow, do not take the single route, do not change shape ability steal aliens army building cannibalism cosmic wars evolution insects kingdom building male protagonist non-humanoid protagonist outer space reincarnated as a monster slow growth at start spaceship technological gap time skip transmigration wars weak to strong. Chapter 1, The Summoning. Haha, I did it. I finally succeeded. Who would have thought that a randomly summoned soul from another world could perfectly fuse with the egg of an Revie? In a small, sealed room, the floor and walls were covered with mysterious symbols. Thin streams of light flickered and flowed across them, emanating an aura of mystery and eeriness. At the center of the room, a tiny white egg, no larger than a fingernail, floated midair. It swayed gently up and down, as if suspended by an invisible force. Standing nearby was a humanoid creature, no taller than 1.5 meters, dressed in a peculiar long robe. It flailed its arms and danced excitedly. Dole was ecstatic. The Revie, known as the infinite evolution insect, was a legendary creature capable of endless adaptation and transformation. As it matured, its appearance could change drastically, with almost no two individuals resembling one another. The ancient book he had found detailed only the characteristics of the egg. Illustrations of the adult forms were marked as hypothetical. It was said that even the Revie themselves might not recognize members of their own species. This unique trait severely hindered their reproduction. Rumor had it that they could only produce an egg under extremely rare circumstances, often at the end of their lifespan. Their harsh reproductive conditions led to their extinction long ago, but this flaw couldn't overshadow their once mighty power. When fully grown and in energy-rich environments, they could rapidly evolve to survive even the harshest conditions. With careful nurturing, a mature Revie could rival the power of a Tier 5 Grand Sorcerer. In the current era, where the strongest sorcerers on the continent were only at Tier 3 high rank, such a being would be akin to a god, capable of unifying the entire continent. Dole, a Tier 2 high rank sorcerer, had reached this level 3 centuries ago. Back then, he was a rising star among his people, hailed as the genius most likely to achieve Tier 3 status before turning 100. During his youthful days of fame and fortune, he stumbled upon the Revie egg during a seemingly routine exploration of ancient ruins. Among his companions, only he recognized the egg's extraordinary origins, thanks to a stroke of luck and some obscure knowledge. Thus, he acquired it at a meager cost. From that moment on, Dole became obsessed, devoting himself entirely to hatching the egg. He dreamed of one day unleashing a Tier 5 pet beast to sweep aside all obstacles and dominate the continent. Unfortunately, fate seemed to mock him. After countless experiments, he furiously discovered that although the egg's larva remained intact, its consciousness had long since dissipated over the endless passage of time. Driven by desperation, Dole scoured ancient texts and conducted endless experiments. At first, his efforts were within reasonable bounds, but as years turned into decades, his mind grew more unhinged. His methods became increasingly extreme and cruel. A once brilliant sorcerer, whose cultivation had stagnated for decades, inevitably attracted attention. Investigations soon uncovered horrifying revelations. Over the span of several decades, more than 100 of Dole's apprentices and servants had mysteriously disappeared. Moreover, he was implicated in numerous cases of illegal human trafficking. Left with no choice, Dole fled with the egg, continuing his experiments while living on the run. He hoped to one day reactivate the egg and reclaim his dreams of glory. 200 years passed. The once arrogant and high-spirited youth had become a stooped old figure. His once thick green hair had thinned to a stubborn tuft clinging to the sides of his ears. But persistence paid off. A few years ago, during another exploration, Dole obtained a blueprint for a summoning array. After some modifications, he used the egg as the array's core. Several trials later, today marked his first successful summoning of a soul from another dimension capable of perfectly merging with the egg. With the soul's infusion, the larva within the egg could finally be revived. His 2 centuries of effort had not been in vain. Soon, those who had driven him from his home would pay the price. Meanwhile, outside the rocky mountain where Dole had hidden, dozens of black-robed figures stood facing each other. "Captain, we've detected traces of a concealed magic array here. Upon investigation, it appears to be Dole's handiwork. However, to avoid alerting him, we didn't act rashly, so we can't confirm whether he's still inside," one of them reported. The captain nodded and directed his team to set up a containment array to surround the mountain. Once all preparations were complete, he raised his hand. A wand slid out from his wide sleeve, which he then gripped tightly. Chanting an incantation under his breath, the energy around him began to boil. A beam of green light shot out from the wand's tip, striking the mountainside. The scenery twisted and distorted, revealing its true form. A deep, dark cave appeared where the mountain had once stood. Inside, Dole, who had been reveling in his success, felt the sudden surge of foreign energy from outside. Just as he turned to investigate, he realized his concealment array had been breached. Years of evading pursuit had made him highly experienced in such situations. Though this lab was only a temporary setup, he had prepared multiple escape routes. As long as even one remained unblocked, he could still escape. Quickly stowing the egg, Dole dashed into a tunnel. Minutes later, his expression turned ashen as he returned to the lab. The surrounding space had been sealed by an unknown magic array, forming an invisible cage that trapped him. Even though a path seemed open ahead, an invisible barrier blocked the way. From outside, the captain's voice rang out, "Dole, did you really think we'd let you escape again without preparation? Surrender now and hand over the Revie. Lord Leon may still spare your life." Leon, once Dole's defeated rival, had been the first to uncover his human experimentation. Now, after 2 centuries, their roles had reversed completely. While Leon's initial motivation may have been simple vengeance against the man who had overshadowed him, he had long since uncovered the truth. His purpose had shifted entirely. Justice for the victims was now little more than a hollow excuse. The Revie was worth any cost. Dole scoffed at Leon's offer of mercy. Surrendering the egg would only guarantee his silence through death. With no way out, Dole came to a desperate decision: to overload the elemental furnace powering the summoning array. The resulting energy surge would reverse the array's operation, teleporting him out instead. Since the array could summon souls from another dimension, surely a mere containment array couldn't stop it. As for where he would end up, that was in the hands of fate. Survival was better than certain death. Resolute, Dole began casting protective spells on himself. Multicolored lights flared around his body. As for the egg, its unhatched Revie larva was protected by its seemingly ordinary but impenetrable shell. Outside, the captain remained patient. His master had assured him that Dole lacked the means to destroy the Revie egg. Thus, he chose a cautious strategy of containment over confrontation. After all, even a cornered old sorcerer might prove dangerous. But the captain's caution proved futile. A blinding white light erupted. The captain, his team of black-robed sorcerers, and the surrounding area were instantly obliterated, leaving behind a hemispherical crater over 10 kilometers in diameter. As for Dole, he had overestimated himself. A mere Tier 2 sorcerer stood no chance against the explosion of an overloaded elemental furnace. He was vaporized in the first instant. Only the Revie egg remained, vanishing in a flicker of light as the summoning array disintegrated. When Luo Wen regained consciousness, his mind was in turmoil. He had just been taking a quick break at work, closing his eyes for a moment to rest. Hours of staring at a computer screen had left his eyes dry and sore. But the next thing he knew, he had fallen asleep and inexplicably woken up in this bizarre situation. He found himself trapped in a dark, slimy prison, surrounded by sticky, disgusting liquid. What kind of prank was this? Sleeping on the job didn't warrant something this extreme. Luo Wen tried to shout, but no sound came out. He attempted to move, but realized with horror that his arms and legs seemed to have multiplied. Frozen in shock, it took him several seconds before he began thrashing wildly. Finally, the prison couldn't withstand his struggles and cracked open. Luo Wen scrambled out through the opening. All around him were enormous rocks, but now that he was free, he felt an inexplicable surge of strength far beyond what he should have. With ease, he pushed the surrounding stones aside, creating a small space for himself. What kind of reality show was this? Had they locked him up and buried him alive? Still groggy from whatever had happened to him, Luo Wen's thoughts remained scattered. But it didn't take long for the horrifying truth to dawn on him. Staring at his hands, if they could still be called that, Luo Wen froze. They were smooth, pitch black, and gleamed with an almost metallic sheen. Instead of fingers, strange jointed appendages protruded from them. Looking down at his body, he saw the same black surface. His abdomen had sprouted 2 pairs of segmented limbs, and his torso extended into a segmented tail. He was no longer human. Chapter 2, Newborn. Luo Wen curled up into a ball, unsure of how long he stayed in that position. Suddenly, he felt something atop his head moving instinctively. A sweet aroma wafted toward him, and an unbearable hunger clawed at his stomach. "Great, just let me starve to death already," he muttered, forcing himself to resist the tempting scent. Luo Wen tried to calm his mind, planning to die by starvation. However, the objects on his head moved more frequently and forcefully, grating on his already frayed nerves. Glancing upward, he was startled to find two stick-like appendages swaying wildly in front of his eyes. "What the hell? I actually grew a pair of antennae." His despair deepened. 10 minutes later, a small black insect was seen crouched beside a massive white egg, devouring it with gusto. The tiny bug was only half the size of the egg, but its tiny mandibles worked furiously. As its saliva coated the shell, the once hard surface rapidly softened. Between bites, the insect also slurped up the egg's viscous interior, alternating between solid and liquid. A perfect combination of hard entree and soup. "Damn, this tastes amazing!" Luo Wen exclaimed. It wasn't that Luo Wen had caved to hunger, no, he told himself it was all to silence the distraction. The gleaming white egg stood out starkly against the pitch-black surroundings, drawing his attention incessantly. Combined with his new vision, which seemed fundamentally different from his past human eyes, the whole thing was making him dizzy. Now that he'd decided to eat this culprit, he could concentrate better, and a full belly might even give him more energy to starve himself properly later. By this point, Luo Wen had pieced together some semblance of understanding about his current situation. In his previous life, he had been a well-informed young man exposed to an onslaught of online media science fiction dramas, web novels, you name it. What he hadn't expected, however, was that his previous life would end so abruptly and that this new life would begin just as unceremoniously. Worse still, he had transmigrated into a bug. Yes, he now understood what he had become. But bugs usually hatch in clusters, don't they? So why was he alone, without any companions? This lack of a reference made it impossible for him to gauge what he looked like. Was he intimidating and awe-inspiring? Or just a plain old creepy crawly? Luo Wen suspected that whatever that green-haired old man had done, or perhaps some innate instinct of the insect body itself, was responsible for his current state. In just one meal's time, Luo Wen had already begun to accept his reality as an insect. He even found himself worrying about his image. After devouring more than half of the eggshell, Luo Wen was full, content, and even feeling a faint sense of happiness. For the moment, he gave up on his thoughts of suicide. When in Rome, do as the Romans do, he mused. If there was a second life, then maybe there could even be a third. At the very least, this was a unique experience. However, just as he was starting to comfort himself, adopting a more optimistic mindset and embracing the idea of living boldly, reality once again delivered a crushing blow. Perhaps his shift in attitude bridged the final gap between his human soul and his insect body. As the two harmonized completely, fragments of information stored within his new body suddenly surged into his mind. The infinite evolution insect? Epheish? So that's what I am in this life? That, actually sounds pretty badass. Wait a second. That green-haired, decrepit old bastard did this to me? Damn it. This wasn't an accident, it was a premeditated attack. If that's the case, my plan to die dramatically and start fresh in another life is completely out the window. Unfortunately, the insect body only retained a small amount of recent information. There were no miraculous bloodline memories or inherited skills, as seen in novels. Luo Wen absorbed what little there was, quickly piecing it together amidst his exasperation. Although the language spoken by that green-haired old man wasn't one Luo Wen had ever encountered, he somehow understood its meaning perfectly. Ugh, just let me die already. Luo Wen's budding optimism quickly evaporated as he curled into a ball once more. Half an hour later, Luo Wen found himself chewing on more eggshells while pondering his newfound insect life. Based on the final images stored in the body's memory, it seemed that he had been teleported away by that summoning array. This left him with 3 possible scenarios for his current location. He had been sent back to his home planet. He was still on that sorcerer-filled continent. He had landed in an entirely unknown place. Determining which of these was the case would require further observation. But for now, that wasn't his top priority. The surrounding environment filled with massive rocks hinted at extreme danger. Judging from the pitch-black surroundings, Luo Wen guessed he was underground. How deep? That, he couldn't say. Now that the white egg had been mostly consumed, the area was even darker. Yet his eyes could still pick up faint traces of a unique type of light. While this light wasn't enough to discern his surroundings in detail, his antennae and even the tiny hairs on his legs provided a strange kind of feedback, guiding him toward the surface. It was an indescribable sensation, one that Luo Wen could only understand through first-hand experience. Following this sense, Luo Wen began using his front legs to claw at the rocks ahead, pulling them toward his abdomen. His middle and hind legs then worked together to push the rocks behind him. Yes, he now had 6 legs. But as a bug, wasn't that perfectly normal? At first, his movements were clumsy, but he quickly got the hang of it. Perhaps he had a natural talent for being a bug. As he dug his way upward, the surrounding rocks gradually grew warmer, until the heat began to make him uncomfortable. The light ahead brightened until, finally, Luo Wen broke through to the surface. And with it, his worst fears were confirmed. A vast expanse of yellow stone reflected the blinding sunlight. The scorching ground burned his abdomen and soft tail, making him feel like he was about to be roasted alive. As he had feared, he was in a desert. The rocks around him were nothing more than coarse sandstones. If he hadn't somehow arrived in a land of giants, it meant his body was extraordinarily tiny. Sure, being small was normal for a bug. But for a former human with 0 experience as an insect, this was a living nightmare. Braving the searing heat, Luo Wen surveyed his surroundings. Not a single trace of vegetation was in sight. His field of vision, however, was bizarre. It reminded him of those massive advertisement screens in shopping malls assembled from dozens of smaller screens that worked in sync to create a seamless image. In his case, it wasn't dozens of screens but thousands, maybe even tens of thousands, densely packed together to form his view of the world. Based on his limited knowledge of entomology, he guessed that he now possessed a pair of compound eyes. Again, normal for a bug. But nobody had told him that compound eyes came with extreme nearsightedness. Up close, everything was crystal clear. But anything farther away was a blurry mess. He couldn't even make out the sun to determine whether it was the same one he had known from his previous life. Still, using some mysterious, insect-specific sense he couldn't describe, he determined that there was only one light source in the sky. The novelty of these abilities was something no human could imagine. Not that Luo Wen was grateful for the experience. He would have gladly passed on it. Given the limited information he'd gathered, the scorching surface temperatures, and the potential dangers of the unknown, Luo Wen's paltry 3 to 4 meter visual range left him feeling deeply insecure. If there was no next life to look forward to, he decided he might as well make the most of this one. His plans for a dramatic death could wait. Survival came first. With his rear end raised, Luo Wen began burrowing back underground. The act of digging felt almost instinctual. In no time at all, he had mastered various excavation techniques, digging up, down, left, and right with ease. Once he reached a sufficient depth, the temperature cooled considerably. Exhausted from the physical exertion of digging and the emotional toll of his situation, Luo Wen finally allowed himself to rest. Curled up in the darkness, one final thought echoed in his mind as he drifted off to sleep. I refuse to live with nearsighted eyes. Chapter 3, Searching for Food. When Luo Wen woke up again, he noticed that the temperature around him had dropped slightly. His stomach growled with hunger, but the eggshell was long gone. It baffled him that an eggshell twice his size had only been enough for 2 meals. He had no idea where all that food had gone. From this, however, he could deduce one thing: his appetite was massive. And while the saying goes, a good appetite is a blessing, it was anything but for Luo Wen in his current situation. The surface was a barren desert, and there was no sign of food anywhere. If this went on, he might starve to death in just a few days. The thought lit a fire under him. He had to find food. He refused to die a starving insect. Relying on his antennae and sensory leg hairs to orient himself, Luo Wen began clawing his way toward the surface. The further he climbed, the colder it became. He began to wonder if he was heading in the wrong direction, but his antennae and leg hairs insisted otherwise. With no other options, he gritted his metaphorical teeth and pressed on. Well, technically, his head was already hard and black, too. When he finally emerged from the sand, he froze in shock. The golden desert was gone, replaced by a silvery layer of frost covering the ground. For a moment, Luo Wen wondered if he had somehow teleported again. What is this place? The temperature difference between day and night is insane. It was night now, and the dim light barely illuminated his surroundings. Strangely, Luo Wen found he could now see up to 5 or 6 meters much farther than before. Was he a nocturnal bug? He wasn't sure. Even with his improved vision, the cool light source in the sky was still too blurry to discern. However, he could sense something else. There were 2 of them. 2 distinct light sources hung in the sky. During the day, there had only been one light source, giving Luo Wen hope that he might have been sent back to his home planet. But now, that hope was completely shattered. Based on his limited knowledge of astronomy, Luo Wen could reasonably conclude that at least 2 moons were orbiting this planet. Still, he accepted this reality rather quickly. After all, he had already been turned into a bug. What was one extra moon in the sky compared to that? The last few days had thrown so many shocks his way that he was starting to become numb to it all. His original 3 possibilities had been reduced to 2, he was either in the sorcerer's world or some other unknown realm. He just hoped it wasn't the sorcerer's world. That place seemed far too dangerous for a little bug like him. For now, though, survival took precedence. If he didn't find food soon, he wouldn't live long enough to figure out where he was. While no food was in sight, the frost-covered ground offered a potential source of water. Luo Wen decided to fill his belly with frost for now and worry about food later. His mouth parts extended a little longer than he expected, with a mushroom-like cap at the tip. The cap spread flat and adhered to the frosty surface, while tiny hidden teeth scraped rapidly against the ice, grinding off small shavings. Aided by his tongue, yes, bugs apparently had tongues, much to his horror, he sucked the ice particles into his body. Luo Wen had no idea what he looked like while eating, and he didn't want to know. He simply followed his instincts and let his body do the work. After a long while, all he'd managed was a shallow depression in the frost. His eating efficiency was dismal, but with no other options, he kept going. The cold liquid trickled into his stomach, and Luo Wen began to feel his entire body stiffen. His thoughts turned sluggish, and his fading consciousness brought back an old human memory, wintertime, when mosquitoes and flies mysteriously vanished. That's when it hit him, he was a bug now. Bugs don't survive well in the cold. And here he was, out in freezing weather, drinking ice-cold water. Was he trying to kill himself? Panicked, Luo Wen snapped out of his stupor and scrambled back underground along the path he had come. This place is insane. Too hot during the day, too cold at night. When am I supposed to go out looking for food? He had planned to scout the area a bit more after drinking his fill, hoping to find something edible, but now that was out of the question. Once he was safely back underground, Luo Wen didn't feel like resting anymore, nor could he afford to. He needed to find a reliable food source as soon as possible. If the surface was too dangerous, then he'd look underground. He had an incredible talent for digging, after all. It would be a waste not to use it. Determined, Luo Wen picked a random direction and began tunneling. His antennae twitched constantly as he worked, sending him both new sensory experiences and useful information. They seemed to function as both a nose and ears, allowing him to detect smells and hear sounds. Midway through his digging, his antennae picked up a strange scent from the lower left. The unfamiliar smell stirred hope in Luo Wen. It could mean food. Excited, he quickened his pace, tunneling toward the source of the scent. But as the smell grew stronger, Luo Wen's caution returned. He was here to find food, not to become someone else's meal. At the moment, his body was still tiny, smaller than a typical housefly, and he had only just been born. He hadn't had any time to learn bug-style combat skills. If he encountered a living creature capable of fighting back, there was a good chance he'd lose. Better to be careful and think things through. Focusing on his insect instincts, Luo Wen's body became hyper-alert. The fine hairs on his legs, and even those covering his entire body, stood on end. The vibrations coming from the front left filtered through his senses and coalesced into information in his mind. After analyzing it, he came to a conclusion. There were living creatures ahead, likely 3 or 4 of them. They were moving slowly and seemed smaller than him. It should be safe to check them out, but if anything went wrong, he'd run. There was no shame in retreating. He didn't know anyone here, so who cared if he lost face? Carefully, Luo Wen clawed at the sandy soil in front of him. His digging techniques proved less effective here. The loose sand he had been working with earlier was easier to handle. The firmer, more compact soil presented a challenge. Thankfully, this area wasn't fully solid, it was a mix of sand and soil. While it slowed him down slightly, he could still make progress. The soil's better structural integrity also worked in his favor. It allowed him to create stable tunnels, which he reinforced as he went. He carefully moved the displaced sand and soil to the looser layers above, ensuring a clear escape route if things went south. After some effort, Luo Wen had dug a tunnel just large enough for his body to pass through. This way, he could retreat quickly if needed. As he drew closer to his target, his movements became more deliberate and his body tensed further. Finally, after scraping away another layer of dirt, a round, plump, white translucent bug rolled into view. The creature's body was segmented into over 10 sections, though only the first few bore 3 pairs of stubby limbs. Its yellowish head looked rather harmless, but Luo Wen was horrified to see it had a pair of huge mandibles. The bug was about the same size as Luo Wen, perhaps slightly smaller. Suddenly unearthed from the soil, it squirmed helplessly, curling and stretching its body while emitting faint hissing noises in an attempt to scare Luo Wen off. Watching the little white bug struggle to flip itself upright, Luo Wen's fear melted away, replaced by growing confidence. He sneered inwardly. "Oh, you think I'm scared of you just because you've got a pair of big teeth? Think again, little guy." Chapter 4, White Grubs. Reality proved that even though Luo Wen wasn't afraid of the white grubs, his current weaponry and equipment were utterly useless against them. The white grub's skin appeared delicate and transparent, as if it could break with a single poke. However, it was incredibly tough, at least from Luo Wen's perspective at the moment. His striding limbs, small claws, and proboscis-like mouthparts were powerless against the white grubs. At this moment, he couldn't help but envy their massive fangs. Watching the fat white grub roll around incessantly as if mocking him, "Come on, do your worst." Luo Wen felt his frustration rise. If he were still human, he could have crushed the white grub into a burst of pulp with just 2 fingers. But thinking about it, the notion felt revolting, so he quickly dismissed the thought from his mind. Suddenly, a realization struck him. The presence of this white grub here meant there had to be food nearby, otherwise, it wouldn't be so lively and energetic. "Just you wait. I'll eat up all your food and starve you to death. Let's see how cocky you'll be then." Luo Wen glared menacingly at the white grub. Without paying it any further attention, he resumed digging. Before long, he unearthed a few more siblings of the white grub. This discovery irritated Luo Wen even more. Why did other insects live in colonies, yet he was all alone? After brushing these annoying worms aside, the soil crumbled to reveal the food they had been guarding. A section of an unknown plant's root emerged from the dirt. Its grayish-brown surface bore several fresh bite marks. Judging from the shape, Luo Wen guessed they had been left by the white grubs. He pressed his proboscis against one of the wounds on the root and began licking. A trickle of liquid slid down his tongue into his esophagus, eventually reaching his abdomen. After only a few licks, the wound stopped oozing. Luo Wen switched to another wound, but each dried up after only a few tries. By the time he had licked his way around the root, he was only about a third full. Attempting to enlarge the wounds with his mouthparts proved futile. After some thought, he shoved one of the rolling white grubs next to the root. As expected, the mindless creature immediately sank its fangs into the food, creating a fresh wound from which tantalizing sap flowed. Luo Wen promptly kicked the worm away and took over the spot for himself. Thanks to the assistance of his tool bug, Luo Wen finally managed to satiate his hunger and quench his thirst. Feeling full and satisfied, he nudged the tool bug back toward the root and kicked the other white grubs even further away. Returning along the tunnel to the sandy layer above, Luo Wen decided to rest. The digging earlier had drained a significant amount of his energy, and the discovery of food had eased his anxiety, allowing him to relax. As for why he chose to travel all the way back to the sandy layer instead of resting near the root, Luo Wen feared that, despite the white grub's herbivorous appearance, they might still bite him on a whim. With his small limbs, those massive fangs could easily sever them. Even if they didn't attack him, waking up to find those fangs dangling in front of his face would be unsettling. After weighing the options, he decided it was safer to rest further away. When Luo Wen awoke again, he had no idea how much time had passed. His once full belly was now empty and growling with hunger. Trying to scratch his abdomen with his forelimbs, Luo Wen suddenly noticed something strange. A new pair of limbs had grown in front of his original forelimbs. These new appendages looked incredibly strong. Their ends resembled rake-like claws, with 4 stubby, robust prongs slightly curved inward. Ifiish, infinite evolution insect, Luo Wen thought of the term inexplicably, and its meaning became clear to him. Before sleeping, he had grumbled about how ineffective his small claws were for digging through dirt. Upon waking, he had grown a pair of limbs that were perfect for the job. For a moment, his thoughts wandered to a game he'd played in his previous life, where there was a type of self-destructing insect. Luo Wen wanted to slap himself. What was he thinking? If he grew something bizarre while sleeping, something that exploded as soon as he woke up, where would he even go to complain? Still, what determined these evolutionary changes? Next time he rested, he would need to give it serious thought. But for now, filling his stomach was the priority. The new rake-like limbs proved to be exceptionally efficient. The prongs easily penetrated the soil, dislodging large chunks with each motion. Strangely, Luo Wen noticed his sense of direction had improved dramatically since becoming an insect. In his human life, he was notoriously bad at navigation, relying on GPS even for short trips. Now, in this pitch-dark underground maze where every direction looked the same, he instinctively knew where to go. He quickly found his way back to the previous tunnel without taking a single wrong turn. Some parts of the tunnel had collapsed, but what had taken great effort to dig through with his small claws before was now a breeze with his new limbs. He now had 8 appendages, though he had never paid much attention to insect anatomy in his previous life. While he had killed his fair share of flies and mosquitoes, he'd never bothered counting their legs. Insects came in so many varieties, and having more legs seemed normal. Take centipedes, for example. He remembered a childhood story about a centipede putting on shoes, which his kindergarten teacher used to tell before nap time. He had never stayed awake long enough to hear the centipede finish. Of course, those legs were natural. His, on the other hand, seemed to grow based on need. Luo Wen worried about what he might turn into if this continued, but then he laughed at himself. He was already an insect, why worry about appearances? It wasn't as though insects had dating standards, he thought. Then again, who knew? He hadn't met any others of his kind yet, so he had no idea what insect aesthetics were like. Suddenly, another thought struck him. Was he male or female? Did insects even have that? He tried feeling for something but found nothing. Could he be a female? If he were still human, his face would undoubtedly have gone pale at this realization. Distraught, Luo Wen reached the plant root again, only to find the white grubs feasting gleefully. Fury surged within him. He rushed forward and kicked them away one by one. Licking the delicious sap while watching the white grubs squirm and roll in frustration, Luo Wen felt much better. As expected, happiness is built on the misery of other insects. Chapter 5, Exploration. Fish, the infinite evolution insect. When adequately fueled, they can adapt to harsh environments through rapid evolution, ensuring their survival. But what if a bug's constant melancholy and desire for death compromised this evolutionary drive? Could Luo Wen's current optimism be linked to his ability to evolve? Luo Wen didn't know and didn't care to think about it deeply. One way or another, he had quickly and naturally accepted his new identity in a short amount of time. More importantly, he had already begun taking proactive steps to improve his quality of life. For instance, instead of returning to his original path after eating his fill, Luo Wen chose to dig deeper underground to construct a new nest. With the help of his newly evolved rake-like appendages, he could burrow into a denser layer of soil further below, where the earth was more compact and structurally sound, reducing the risk of collapses. In just half a day, he excavated a chamber roughly the size of a ping-pong ball. Given that his body was smaller than a fingernail, the room felt quite spacious. He lined the floor with dry sand and stones to keep the ground from becoming damp, though he wasn't sure if insects could get arthritis. Once his new home was complete, Luo Wen dug several connected tunnels leading to it. Some served as main entrances, while others were emergency escape routes. These pathways interlinked, and their entrances were sealed with dirt, making it difficult for any intruders to find them. Additionally, he dug out a separate area as a latrine, far from his main chamber. A long passageway connected it, lined with soft sand to block any odors from wafting back. This effort seemed excessive, considering Luo Wen hadn't relieved himself since his birth. Lying in his cozy new chamber, Luo Wen began contemplating his bug life. From his observations, it was clear that he possessed remarkable evolutionary abilities. However, the mechanism behind this evolution and its limitations remained unclear. So far, he had experienced only one obvious evolution, and there might have been others more subtle that he hadn't noticed yet. More time and data would be needed to uncover the full extent of his abilities. However, he didn't know how much time he had. From his limited knowledge of entomology, he was aware that most insects didn't live very long. Even though his species sounded impressive, He hadn't been given a manual at manufacturing to confirm how long he could survive. Moreover, this wasn't Earth, and he wasn't an Earth species. The knowledge from his old world might not even apply here. After much thought, he ended up where he started without enough information. Everything was just speculation. Still, he recalled his previous trip to the surface. While he couldn't measure the temperature precisely, it had definitely been below freezing. He had spent a fair amount of time outside, even drinking lots of cold liquid, yet aside from some discomfort, he had bounced back after a nap without any ill effects. If an insect on Earth endured such conditions, it would likely end up partially paralyzed. This suggested that his current situation couldn't be measured by earthly standards, especially given his patchy and dubious knowledge. Having exhausted his train of thought, Luo Wen managed to kill some time through pure imagination. In his previous life, Luo Wen had been inseparable from his phone. Reading, browsing videos, anything to pass the time. Now, without such distractions, he found the hours unbearably slow and realized he needed to find new activities. No sooner had he thought this than he acted. After a moment of consideration, Luo Wen decided to eat again. He had worked hard moving to his new home and needed to celebrate with something good. With the reluctant help of his tool bug, Luo Wen soon had his fill. But once again, boredom set in. Not wanting to rest just yet, he decided to dig along the route he'd been feeding on, curious to see where it led. During his previous trips to the surface, he hadn't noticed any vegetation, partly due to his extreme nearsightedness. His curiosity about what desert plants on this alien planet might look like drove him forward. Following the route, Luo Wen discovered more of the white grub siblings along the way. From the looks of it, they were a large family. Luo Wen felt no envy. Numbers didn't matter when they were all just a bunch of foolish tool bugs. The path sloped upward gradually, and Luo Wen had no idea how long he had been digging when he encountered a much thicker root. It turned out the previous route was merely a lateral offshoot. As he continued, more roots branched out, their numbers increasing until they became a dense network of large roots spreading into unknown regions. The temperature around him rose steadily. Fine, thread-like roots began to appear, distinctly different from the larger ones. As he dug upward, the surroundings grew brighter. It seemed to be daytime above. Having already experienced one day-night cycle, Luo Wen could now estimate the time based on the light levels underground. Slowing his pace, Luo Wen became more alert, his fine hairs standing on end as he cautiously scanned his surroundings. Underground, his digging speed gave him a clear advantage. On the surface, however, even a fingernail-sized opponent might overwhelm him. Near his new home, soil at this depth had already transitioned to sandy layers. Here, however, possibly due to the dense root network, the soil remained compacted, without any signs of sandification. This layer presented new dangers. Through vibrations in the ground, Luo Wen could sense numerous hollow tunnels surrounding him. These were more intricate than the passages he had constructed at his home. Within them, he detected movements and sounds of unknown creatures. Carefully avoiding these passages, Luo Wen continued his slow ascent. Finally, after breaking through a shallow layer of sandy soil, he reached the surface. It was indeed daytime. Beside him stood a cluster of massive weeds, with more scattered around. Most of their leaves had withered and yellowed. It seemed the fine roots he had seen earlier belonged to these plants. In the distance loomed a colossal tree. By Luo Wen's rough estimate, it would take hundreds of him linking arms to encircle the trunk. This excursion yielded several revelations. First, Luo Wen discovered he wasn't nocturnal. In daylight, he could see as far as 5 or 6 meters. It seemed his repeated wish not to be nearsighted had been granted. His vision had improved significantly. Still, it wasn't enough. The towering tree, for instance, was mostly a blur. He could only make out part of it. Details like its height, leaves, flowers, or fruit remained beyond his sight. Clearly, his vision still had room for evolution. Secondly, Luo Wen noticed that he wasn't as affected by heat as before. Whether this was due to increased heat resistance or the shade of the tree remained to be seen. He made a mental note to find a sunny spot later for comparison. Finally, he discovered the owners of the underground tunnels. Among the weeds, several ant-like creatures appeared. They were yellowish-brown, with round heads, long antennae, 6 slender legs, and disproportionately large, hook-like mandibles that were half their body size, distinctly menacing. These creatures surrounded Luo Wen in an unfriendly manner. Using the small pores on his rear as a makeshift gut instinct, Luo Wen guessed they weren't here to welcome him. Chapter 6, under attack. As it turned out, Luo Wen's earlier suspicion about the small hole near his rear end was correct. The ant-like creatures were exceptionally aggressive. One of the closest ants swayed its antennae, its six-jointed limbs slightly bending before springing forward all at once, launching itself right at Luo Wen. Its hooked mandibles lifted slightly before clamping down in a swift motion, aiming to lock onto him. Of course, Luo Wen wasn't about to roll over and take it. While his compound eyes were terribly nearsighted, their thousands of lenses forming individual images gave him excellent dynamic vision. To put it into perspective, if a human eye found watching a screen with a 60 Hz refresh rate smooth and lag-free, Luo Wen's dynamic vision was 10 times better. For him, that 60 Hz screen would seem like a slideshow, stuttering between frames for what felt like an eternity. Yet, the ant's launch speed was so fast that it exceeded the reaction threshold of human vision. Even for Luo Wen, while he could track its movements, there was no bullet time advantage. He quickly used 3 of his elongated striding limbs on one side to kick against the ground, propelling himself into a roll and narrowly avoiding the attacking mandibles. The close call left Luo Wen drenched in cold sweat. His current insect body lacked the flexibility of a human's. Movements humans could execute with ease, such as rolling, were tremendously taxing for him. This time, he was lucky. After rolling twice, he ended up belly down, still sprawled on the ground. If his push-off had been weaker, or if any other mishap had occurred leaving him flipped belly up, it would have spelled disaster. In his current form, flipping over was a monumental task, leaving him entirely at the mercy of the ants. One-on-one, Luo Wen felt he could handle these ants, which were slightly smaller than him. But clearly, they had no intention of fighting fair, showing every sign of ganging up on him. Discretion being the better part of valor, Luo Wen raised his rear and prepared to flee. On the ground, he couldn't match the ants' speed, but he had his own advantage. Despite his short tenure as an insect, he had already observed that while their forelimbs were adequate for clawing at sand and gravel, they were woefully unsuited for digging through soil. The ground here was layered with loose sand and gravel, but beneath it lay soil. If he could burrow into the soil layer, he'd be safe. Unfortunately, Luo Wen underestimated the ants' launch speed and range. Several ants leaped simultaneously, their mandibles clamping onto him just as half his body disappeared into the dirt. 2 even pierced his abdomen, collectively pulling to drag him back out. If they succeeded, it would be game over for Luo Wen. Determined to survive, he desperately clawed at the ground with his digging limbs, braced his midlimbs against nearby gravel, and kicked frantically with his hind legs. One of the ants gripping Luo Wen's abdomen surged forward. In addition to its conspicuous hooked mandibles, it had a pair of smaller, pincer-like black-brown jaws near its mouth. Luo Wen's flailing hind leg happened to strike directly in front of its jaws. The ant reacted quickly, snapping down on the leg. Whether other insects felt pain, Luo Wen didn't know, but he was sure of one thing: he currently had no pain sensation. Otherwise, with his injuries, a human body would have passed out long ago from the agony. As if this weren't enough, some of the ants stabilized themselves with their 6 legs, raised their thoraxes vertically, and stretched their abdomens forward until they were even with their heads, resembling scorpions about to sting. Their swollen abdomens pulsed, and from the nozzle at the tip, a turbid liquid spurted forth. Upon contact with air, the liquid emitted a wisp of white smoke. The liquid arced through the air, landing precisely around Luo Wen, splattering parts of his posterior abdomen. The contact caused small, pitted wounds as his body was corroded. Crap! Luo Wen thought bitterly. These shameless creatures are using fecal spray attacks. And it's toxic. I've never seen a species so devoid of honor. Faced with a life-or-death situation, Luo Wen seemed to muster strength from every fiber of his being, even his bristles standing on end. After a desperate struggle, he finally broke free, burrowing completely into the gravel layer and disappearing from view. Once underground, Luo Wen left the ants far behind. They couldn't even catch a glimpse of his rear hole. Now temporarily safe, Luo Wen stopped. Exhausted, he found himself in a pitiful state. Both his hind legs bore bite marks of varying severity, one of them broken in the middle and missing a large segment. Fortunately, with so many legs, losing 2 wasn't a significant hindrance to his mobility. His posterior half, while affected by the corrosive spray, didn't sustain as much damage as he'd feared. Likely, the brief exposure and limited dosage caused only superficial injuries, sparing his internal structure. Unable to see his own back, Luo Wen could only sense that the damage wasn't too severe. However, the wound on his abdomen was another story. The soft abdomen had been torn open at the third segment from the rear, leaving it barely attached to his body by a thin strip of skin. Internal organs or whatever constituted them in his current form had trailed out along the way, leaving nothing left to spill. Good thing I'm an insect now. If I were human and this gutted, I'd definitely be dead. Even though he wasn't dead yet, Luo Wen had no idea how much longer he could hold on with such severe injuries. But there was little he could do. No bandages or gauze were available, and even if they were, his current limbs couldn't manage the dexterity for such tasks. What he wouldn't give for access to the internet right now, to post his predicament and tack on a desperate plea, urgent, need help. But that was wishful thinking. Luo Wen suspected these idle thoughts were a sign he was nearing death, his mind starting to wander. Vibrations sensed by his bristles snapped him back to reality. The ants were tracking him by the trail of fluid his wounds left behind. This place was no longer safe. Raising his rear again, Luo Wen resumed digging. Earlier, he'd noticed that the ants and their tunnels didn't extend to the deeper underground layers. It seemed they preferred not to live there, and their forelimbs were ill-suited for excavating soil. If he continued downward, he could lose them for good. Luo Wen had no idea how long he had been digging. His consciousness began to blur. Though he felt no pain, his grievous injuries left him physically and mentally drained. Through the haze, he sensed familiar vibrations ahead, white bugs gnawing at tree roots. Using the last of his strength, Luo Wen crawled forward. Sure enough, a fat, white grub was using its large mandibles to strip bark and feast on the succulent sap. Without hesitation, Luo Wen kicked the grub aside and latched onto the wound in the tree root, furiously licking at the sap. The cool, slightly sweet liquid flowed down his throat into his body, reaching his abdomen, only to leak out through his wound. Luo Wen felt a wave of despair. Weakly, he burrowed a short distance to the side before his vision went black, and he lost consciousness. Chapter 7 Enhancements. When Luo Wen regained consciousness, he had no idea how much time had passed. Though he remained motionless, the bristles on his body informed him that the white grub beside him was still tirelessly gnawing at the tree root. Still an insect, hey? How am I even alive after all this? He had harbored a sliver of hope, wishing that death might grant him a third life or return him to his previous one. Unexpectedly, this seemingly impressive insect species turned out to have an astonishing vitality. Despite being gutted, with food passing straight through his body without nourishment, he had somehow survived. It was truly unbelievable. But there was no time for amazement. A quick inspection of his body revealed that the 3 abdominal segments dangling from his abdomen had shriveled and detached, lying discarded nearby. The wound had healed, but no new body segments had grown to replace them, leaving his body visibly shorter. He couldn't see the injuries on his back, but they didn't seem to be serious. The wound on his broken hind leg had also healed, although it hadn't regrown. His hunger was now extreme. Since his rear had healed, this meant that the food he ate would now stay inside. Dragging his weakened body, Luo Wen forced himself back to the tree root. The white grub was still contentedly sipping sap. Without hesitation, he kicked it aside and moved in to feed. After licking his fill, he grabbed the white grub and opened another sap wound. Repeating this cycle several times, Luo Wen finally felt full. Having eaten his fill, fatigue overtook him once again. Ignoring everything else, Luo Wen dragged himself back to his hiding spot and passed out. Thus began a routine of waking, kicking the white grub, feeding, and collapsing back into unconsciousness. After countless repetitions, Luo Wen's spirit finally recovered. Around him lay scattered molds from his shedding. By now, his appearance had drastically changed. First, his eyes had grown significantly larger, taking up nearly half of his head. His field of vision had expanded dramatically, resembling a 360-degree wide-angle camera that allowed him to see even his own back. For the first time, Luo Wen could observe his back. Although he didn't know what it had looked like before, he noticed a small patch of hard armor there, while the rest of his long abdomen had been exposed. This vulnerability explained why the ants had been able to target his abdomen so easily. Now, his neck area sported an expanded shoulder plate that stretched to cover his sides, greatly increasing his lateral defense. That wasn't all. Behind this shoulder plate, a semicircular back plate had grown, shielding his shortened abdomen. His entire back now resembled a 7-spotted ladybug, except his back armor was solid black and covered with bristles. His previously maimed hind leg had fallen off entirely, only to regrow, thicker and more robust than before, bristling with sharp spines. In addition, he discovered 2 new hind legs capable of bending in reverse. If he were to flip onto his back, his now rounder body might make flipping over even harder. But on the contrary, these new hind legs could press against the ground and push him upright. Lastly, his mouth parts had undergone a transformation. His previous lapping-sucking mouth parts had shrunk significantly, and now, as if driven by a subconscious desire to avoid relying on the white grub, he had grown the large mandibles he had longed for. He could finally drink sap independently. The myriad problems he had encountered in his prior struggles had all been addressed during this evolution. Luo Wen couldn't help but exclaim internally, "Efi-ish, you're incredible." Even with his comprehensive enhancements, Luo Wen had no intention of immediately seeking revenge on the ants. 2 fists couldn't fend off 4 hands, let alone the many hands the ants had. Through this intensive, multifaceted evolution, Luo Wen had gained a better understanding of his body. Firstly, evolution adhered to the principle of energy conservation, which explained his repeated need to eat throughout the process. Secondly, when faced with certain challenges, his body would instinctively activate the most suitable genes from its internal gene pool. Sufficient energy expedited this activation. For example, when he had trouble digging earlier, his recently replenished energy stores had quickly enabled him to grow digging limbs. Luo Wen sensed that as he continued to grow and mature, he might eventually be able to actively choose which genes to activate. The diversity of the gene pool, however, depended on the insect's mother. If the egg had been laid under ideal conditions, it would be stocked with abundant resources. The opposite was also true. Unfortunately, Luo Wen belonged to the latter group. Like most Efi-ish offspring, he had been hastily laid as a last resort, leaving him with barely any genetic inventory. His pool only contained basic genes for digging, feeding, and minor resistances like fire and frost, just enough to survive the larval stage. But even this was sufficient. After surviving the vulnerable early stage, larvae would inevitably encounter a vast array of organisms, witnessing their unique strengths and abilities, and then selecting the most suitable ones to arm themselves. This realization led Luo Wen to reconsider. Perhaps his initial understanding had been wrong. The lack of advanced genetic material might not have been due to oversight but rather a deliberate, calculated decision. Every Efi-ish's environment was unique, exposing them to wildly different organisms. Without first-hand experience, activating random genetic sequences would waste energy at best. At worst, it could result in maladaptive traits. Perhaps long ago, some Efi-ish had recklessly activated untested gene sequences in response to difficulties, only to exacerbate their problems or even lose their lives. It was possible that leaving only basic genetic fragments was itself an evolutionary adaptation. Reflecting on this, Luo Wen felt the decision made perfect sense. It was as if someone had left a gene for self-destruction in the pool. If one day he desperately sought a quick way to boost power with minimal side effects, the gene pool, lacking wisdom, might instinctively suggest this extreme solution. Unaware of its function, he might activate it and wake up as a living bomb. Luo Wen maliciously speculated that some predecessors might have encountered such a fate. For now, Luo Wen could finally rest easy, no longer fearing that impulsive thoughts might lead to his doom. Chapter 8, Curiosity. So, how does one enrich their genetic library? The method was surprisingly simple: pick a creature with desirable traits and eat it. The prerequisite, of course, was that you could defeat it in the first place. That's not simple at all. Luo Wen muttered under his breath. Fortunately, he had a creature on hand that he could easily handle. He began considering what traits the white grub might offer him. Its plump, white, soft body? Its sluggish movements? Its stubby, awkward limbs? So far, the only thing that had piqued his interest was its prominent mandibles, but he'd already grown his own pair. With that thought, Luo Wen realized that the only creature he could currently defeat had no practical value to him. He felt a twinge of frustration. But then he reconsidered perhaps there was some value after all. Meat offered far more energy than sap or plant roots. Luo Wen had long been curious about how the white grub tasted. Was it really like crispy chicken? Unfortunately, his previous mandibles had been too weak, and his claws too ineffective, to penetrate the grub's tough hide. Now that he had a pair of sharp mandibles, it was finally time to give it a try. The body of the Efi-ish was subtly altering his mind. In his previous life as a human, he would never have dreamed of eating a grub, let alone raw. But now, he found the white grub's tender flesh surprisingly enticing. Looking at the grub before him, Luo Wen hesitated. This particular one was an old acquaintance, a trusty tool during his recovery. After a moment of hesitation, Luo Wen decided to let it go. I really am a kind-hearted insect, he sighed, quietly patting himself on the back. Digging a bit further, he soon unearthed another white grub. This one hadn't helped him at all. It wasn't a familiar grub, so there was no need to feel bad about eating it. Luo Wen's sharp mandibles tasted their first battle and achieved resounding success. The group's previously impenetrable skin was easily pierced. Ignoring its frantic writhing, Luo Wen extended his lapping and sucking mouth parts into its body. He quickly discovered a problem: his mouth parts needed further evolution. Eating meat was still awkward. These mouth parts were excellent for consuming soft substances, such as liquids or gels. However, when faced with anything tougher like meat, they lacked the necessary strength. The grub gradually stopped struggling as its body deflated. Luo Wen withdrew his mouth parts and wiped his abdomen with his midlimbs before moving to a tree root nearby. He bit into it and drank some sap, finally sated. The taste was decent overall, and Luo Wen nodded in satisfaction. From now on, he could officially consider himself a carnivorous insect. Leaving behind the drained husk of the grub, Luo Wen burrowed back to his self-constructed home. It looked exactly as he had left it. No unexpected visitors had dropped by. Lying in his chamber, Luo Wen began contemplating after his meal. Enriching his genetic library was definitely a priority, but it wasn't urgent. During this latest evolution, he had learned more about his body. Beyond his genetic repository, there was information about his lifespan. The Revie was, after all, an extraordinary species in this world. Even its larvae had a lifespan of at least a century, and as they matured, this lifespan would only increase. How long he could ultimately live was unknown, especially since continuous evolution would accompany his growth. What a mature Revie might become was beyond even the imagination of its progenitor. In this foreign land, any creature with a bizarre appearance or mysterious origin was often attributed to the Revie. Whether such claims were true or not was anyone's guess. Of course, the information Luo Wen had received made no such assertions. The insect that left these messages had no concept of time, it only knew it had lived for a very, very long time. Its method of measurement was peculiar, the rise and fall of 3 kingdoms. Luo Wen mulled over this for a while. A kingdom's establishment and collapse could hardly occur in a short span based on his knowledge from his previous life. 3 kingdoms. That could be an unimaginable length of time. History wasn't his strong suit, so he couldn't calculate precisely. Regardless, he now had an explanation for his lifespan, which eased his mind considerably. After all, he had always thought of insects as short-lived creatures. As for how that ancient insect managed to end its own existence, Luo Wen couldn't find any clues, even after repeatedly reviewing the information. Well, so be it. Luo Wen wasn't too concerned, he was only mildly curious. With the pressure of time gone and an ample food supply secured, he felt relaxed. The roots of the great tree spread over an unknown expanse, hosting countless white grubs. Given his current size, it would take a long time to consume them all. Furthermore, these grubs were clearly larvae of some other insect. What did their adults look like? How often did they reproduce? How long did it take for new eggs to hatch or larvae to reach their current size? Luo Wen realized he now had a long-term research goal. If these white grubs were a quickly regenerating resource, his food supply problem was effectively solved. As for the yellow earth ants, Luo Wen considered himself above holding grudges. However, now that he was an insect, vengeance was a given. He wasn't in a hurry, though. He decided to bide his time and grow stronger first. Even if he didn't evolve new abilities for a while, he could continue enhancing his existing genetic fragments. He could become stronger, his exoskeleton thicker, and his defenses and resistances more formidable. Those ants were the second species he had encountered in this unfamiliar world, and they represented an excellent source of genetic material. Their spring-loaded movements, hook-like mandibles, and feces-spraying magic attacks, all of these would be his eventually. Thinking about that last point made him annoyed. Everyone else was fighting hand-to-hand, and suddenly they pulled out a disgusting ranged attack. Who does that? Oh right, they weren't human. Still, if it weren't for those surprise attacks, Luo Wen was confident he wouldn't have fled so pathetically. He might have even taken a few of them down with him. Immersed in his imagination, Luo Wen's consciousness gradually drifted into darkness. A strange noise and intense vibration startled him awake. Luo Wen swiftly climbed to his feet. His fine hairs bristled as the bizarre sound persisted. Something was happening on the surface. Insects might not possess curiosity, but Luo Wen had the soul of a human, and humans were inherently curious, often dangerously so. After pacing a few laps, he couldn't resist his growing curiosity and decided to investigate. As he climbed, Luo Wen's thoughts wandered. Maybe two colossal beasts were battling it out above, and a few drops of their blood might accidentally fall on him, catapulting him to the pinnacle of insect life. He chuckled to himself. That's how these stories always go. The more he imagined, the more excited he became, quickening his pace. But as the saying goes, curiosity kills the cat, or in this case, the insect. When Luo Wen neared the surface, he realized the strange noise was merely howling wind. The vibrations were caused by sand whipping against the ground. Feeling a bit deflated, he decided to retreat. Suddenly, a sense of immense danger washed over him, causing his fine hairs to stand on end. Before he could react, a powerful force lifted him into the air, along with the surrounding sand and stones. Chapter 9, Severely Injured. Luo Wen felt he had been too reckless. After realizing there was a storm outside, he should have retreated immediately instead of staying to daydream. Didn't he know that being a spectator came with risks? Now, not only had he been forced into a front row seat, but he'd also been dragged into the performance. If given another chance, he would stay in his burrow no matter what happened outside. He'd stake his pride on not moving a muscle. The sky was pitch black, with the ferocious storm howling like a ghost. It whipped up a barrage of sand and stones, which, under the storm's force, shot forward like bullets. Unfortunately, Luo Wen was directly in the path of the onslaught. Though his small body made for a minor target, the density of the sandstorm ensured countless particles still struck him. Luo Wen curled all his limbs toward his head, shielding his compound eyes with his digging limbs. The rest of his legs surrounded his head as best they could. He twisted his body to present his back to the storm's direction. His newly grown shoulder plates and dorsal armor offered considerable protection. Though he felt no pain, the fine hairs on his exoskeleton told him the sand and stones had not yet breached his defenses. Despite this, the relentless impacts sent his body tumbling through the air, making it nearly impossible to maintain balance. Amid the disorienting spins, his unprotected abdomen bore the brunt of the damage. The dorsal armor covered much of it, but the sandstorm's 360-degree assault spared no part of his body. His already shortened abdomen took another round of severe hits. Luo Wen didn't have the luxury of addressing his abdominal injuries. Nor did he bother keeping his back to the storm, as constant tumbling and the storm's unpredictable gusts rendered his efforts futile. Finally, he resorted to curling his neck, shielding his head with his limbs, and leaving his fate to luck. He'd survived an abdominal injury before, but a crushed head would mean certain death. He still had so much time to live, he didn't want his journey to end prematurely. The world around him was shrouded in darkness. The howling winds and flying debris disoriented him completely. Not that it mattered, he was quickly swept farther away by the storm. After an indeterminate time, during which even his tough dorsal armor began to sustain damage, Luo Wen noticed the wind's intensity lessening. It seemed he had endured the worst. But now, a new problem emerged. He couldn't fly. He'd only hatched a few days ago and hadn't had time to develop such capabilities. Even if he could fly, his tiny body would be powerless against the might of nature. At this moment, Luo Wen had no idea how high he'd been swept. His poor vision was useless in the dim, low-visibility environment. Even with his former human eyes, he doubted he could have seen much in these conditions. Eventually, Luo Wen felt himself descending. Thankfully, while the wind had weakened, it still occasionally lifted his lightweight body, cushioning his fall somewhat. His hollow internal structure made him lighter, and the semicircular shape of his dorsal armor acted like a parachute. By some miracle, he landed from an unknown height without sustaining significant impact damage. No wonder he'd never heard of insects dying from falls in his previous life. It turned out that even wingless insects possessed innate adaptations to survive such situations. After being blown around a couple more times upon landing, Luo Wen finally settled safely on the ground. Without pausing to assess his injuries, he immediately began digging into the earth. Thanks to years of watching disaster movies, Luo Wen knew tornadoes had calm eyes. But he couldn't tell if he was in the storm's eye or even if this was a tornado at all. Not that he wanted to find out. He was just an insect now, focused solely on survival. Staying on the surface was a death wish. Only by burrowing deep underground could he find any sense of security. Luo Wen dug deeper than ever before, descending well past his previous home's depth. When he hit a layer of soil, he kept going, ensuring he was far below any potential surface threats. As he worked, he felt an overwhelming sense of frustration. Just when his life had started to stabilize, when he'd barely had time to enjoy his new home and the seemingly endless supply of white grubs, it was all taken away because he couldn't resist the urge to check out some commotion. Now, all he could do was lament his terrible luck. His injuries, however, were an even greater source of despair. One of his digging limbs was broken. Several of his mid and hind legs were either completely snapped or heavily damaged. The few intact ones had suffered varying degrees of wear and tear. His head and eyes, while protected, hadn't escaped unscathed. He noticed several black spots in his vision, likely caused by damage to some of his compound eyes lenses. He had no idea if they would heal. His antennae, left unprotected, had also suffered, half of one was missing. The damage to his shoulder and dorsal plates was severe, with a large chunk of the dorsal armor completely gone. The worst injury was to his recently healed abdomen. Last time, he'd lost 3 segments of tissue, shrinking his overall size. While this time he didn't lose entire segments, many areas were severely damaged, exposing his internal structures. Yet amidst the despair, Luo Wen noticed something interesting. Within the hollow cavities of his abdomen were fibrous tissues that quickly patched the wounds, preventing fluid loss. It seemed this was a result of his previous evolution. The changes were internal and had gone unnoticed until now. Still, Luo Wen had no desire to discover these adaptations. Nevertheless, the fibrous tissues played a crucial role. While his abdominal injuries looked more severe than last time, the self-repair mechanism had stabilized the damage, preventing further deterioration. At least now, he wouldn't experience the grotesque phenomenon of food leaking out as he ate. With his remaining antenna and fine hairs raised, Luo Wen detected no unusual scents or vibrations. Sensing safety, he slowly closed his eyes. He needed rest, a chance to use his stored energy to begin healing. This time, his injuries were far worse than before. Almost every part of his body was damaged. Even his relatively protected head and eyes bore significant scratches and abrasions. The environment, too, was far more hostile than before. Last time, he'd had access to nearby food, allowing him to replenish energy during recovery. This time, though he'd recently eaten a white grub, the storm had drained much of his reserves. Moreover, his abdomen's ruptures, despite the fibrous patches, had still cost him some stored nutrients. At best, his current energy reserves were only half of their full capacity. Faced with these challenges, Luo Wen's body had no choice but to alter its recovery strategy. Chapter 10, Recovery. Deep underground, a black insect lay motionless, its body severely damaged and over half of it crippled, appearing lifeless. Suddenly, viscous liquid began seeping out of its body through its eyes, mouth parts, and the base of the hairs covering its body. Under the influence of these liquids, the insect's black head, fragile eyes, delicate mouthparts, rotting abdomen, and even its sturdy shoulder plates and back armor underwent a miraculous chemical reaction, as if they were melting. White foam appeared, expanded, and then slowly hardened, eventually forming a cocoon-like structure resembling the black insect, but significantly larger. The cocoon completely encased the insect. Luo Wen's consciousness floated in the darkness, fluctuating as if he were drowning, his body being churned into pulp. The discomfort was suffocating, and he struggled desperately to escape his plight. Outside, the cocoon, shaped like a black insect, began to tremble as if something trapped inside was attempting to break free. The trembling intensified, growing faster and more vigorous until a crack appeared along the top of the cocoon. From the crack emerged a head, smooth, tender, and translucent yellowish white. It looked fragile, as if it would shatter at the slightest touch, with its internal organs faintly visible. The creature, through sheer effort, gradually forced its burrowing legs out. With these legs anchoring it externally, the tender insect soon managed to pull its entire body free from the cocoon. Exhausted from the struggle, the insect rested briefly on the cocoon. At this moment, its once yellowish-white, tender body rapidly turned black and hardened. Its outermost skin transformed into an exoskeleton, encasing its entire body. In the blink of an eye, it reverted to its black insect form. Luo Wen examined his body and found that he had shrunk significantly. The size he had nearly reached a fingernail had reverted to his original size at birth. Though no new organs or limbs had appeared, the damage to his body had been fully repaired. Even the black spots that had marred his vision were gone, and his sight was clear once more. His antennae waved, and the two identical length appendages swayed in front of his eyes, soothing his compulsive tendencies. This recovery was largely thanks to the white insect he had devoured. The newly activated cocooning ability drew much of its genetic material from it. Combined with some of Luo Wen's inherent genetic fragments, the fusion and refinement triggered by a life and death crisis had led to his current state. Simply patching together parts and organs from other insects would create an unsightly chimera. Only through fusion, refinement, and evolution could the abilities of Yi truly shine. Unfortunately, Luo Wen was still a larva and could not actively select which genetic fragments to activate, let alone integrate and refine them. This time's success was merely a lucky accident triggered by the instinct to survive as his life ebbed away. Regardless of the benefits, Luo Wen did not wish to attempt such a process again. He had no pressing goals to achieve, and surviving to reach maturity naturally seemed the proper course. Risking his life recklessly in pursuit of power was not a choice he would make. Though his body was fully healed, his energy reserves were critically low. The repairs had consumed not just his energy but even some of his bodily tissues, leaving him smaller overall. Luo Wen now needed to find food urgently. Without replenishment, his survival strategy of cautious endurance would be nothing but empty talk. He set his burrowing legs to work and chose a random direction to dig, as all paths seemed equally unfamiliar in this strange environment. Luo Wen's digging speed was impressive, though he felt he could go even faster. However, his newly evolved 360-degree panoramic vision provided by his large bulbous eyes was more of a hindrance than a help underground. It allowed him to see farther, but being surrounded by earth, it was nearly useless. Moreover, he had to divert attention to protect his fragile eyes while digging, significantly slowing him down. Upon reflection, he decided that slowing down wasn't necessarily a bad thing. This wasn't his familiar territory. He had no idea where he was or what dangers might lurk underground. Better to proceed cautiously. He reduced his speed further, employing his antennae and body hairs at full capacity to scan for potential threats. In the desert, resources were scarce. Luo Wen had been lucky to find suitable food near his birthplace. But that luck seemed to have run out. After burrowing for an indeterminate amount of time, his already dwindling energy reserves were nearing depletion, yet he had found no sign of food. Desperate, he decided to dig straight downward. Gradually, large rocks appeared around him. Following the crevices between the stones, he continued digging until the scattered rocks fused into a solid layer of bedrock. Suddenly, strong vibrations reverberated through the rock. His antennae detected dense moisture in the air, and the faint sound of running water reached his ears. Luo Wen deduced that there might be an underground river beneath the rocks. Guided by the moisture, he crawled toward the source. Before long, he found a small crack in the previously impenetrable rock layer, through which the sound of flowing water became clearer. Taking advantage of his small size, Luo Wen wriggled through the crack. As he progressed, the surrounding rock walls darkened and became slick with moisture condensed from the dense humidity in the air. Black spots began to appear on the walls, resembling some kind of plant, perhaps moss. However, this wasn't his old territory, and their unusual color left him uncertain about their identity. In this environment, his burrowing legs were almost useless. Luo Wen used the hooked claws on his other 6 limbs to anchor himself to pits and grooves on the rock's surface. He extended his mouthparts, which formed a dish-like structure at the mushroom-shaped tip, and pressed them against the rock. Hidden fine hairs and a small tongue quickly scraped up the moisture. The cold underground water flowed into his esophagus and then his body, its minerals and microorganisms rapidly digested to replenish his depleted energy reserves slightly. Luo Wen drank until he could no longer stomach another drop, then rested nearby. Once he digested the water, he would resume drinking. However, relying solely on water to replenish energy was excruciatingly slow. Luo Wen drank until he nearly vomited and, for the first time since his birth, urinated. He had never urinated, even when he drank root fluids daily. This first experience was novel, though it wasn't his focus. Drawing from his past human experiences specifically as a man, he knew that urination required certain organs. Naturally, as a newly insectal being, Luo Wen needed to examine his body after this unprecedented act.